Thanks, Nectaris. All right, so I've put the recording on. I think you just have to accept that. Here today to welcome everybody on behalf of the Queensland branch of the Australian University Safety Association. We're going to be looking at performance data and seeing how useful it is for us to be using. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and the Yagara people on whose lands our panelists who are participating today live and work, and acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. We'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where you're joining us from today, and we pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their wisdom, forbearance, and spirit of learning. We respectfully recognise the role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our universities and our research centres and in the wider community. We celebrate that the lands on which we study and work have always been places of learning, research and engagement. So today, I've invited 4 people to talk to us to bring a different perspective to talking about performance data and how we use that. So our first panelist today is Nectaris, Associate Professor from QUT, where I work in health and safety. So there's a bit of a background to his experience as an academic and as a professional, having worked in health and safety in that field as well. Lots of publications and attendance at conferences, presentations. Then we'll hear from Scott Brunel. So many of you will know Scott has been our former president of QUSA. He has most recently worked at Griffith University and has just left us to go into Bupa. So a slightly different focus, but he was involved in a project for Griffith University in terms of looking at safety data and the metrics. And so he's going to be talking about some of that experience. The third panelist is unfortunately not able to attend today, and that's Peter he's a director in the Office of Industrial Relations. Peter shared his slides with me 2 weeks ago, and I don't have his consent, but I have his slides and I'm going to present his presentation. I just can't take questions from him. We can collect those questions and we can seek some feedback from him and I can share with you later. So happy to take questions that you would want to ask Peter, but we can't have an answer. I can't speak on his behalf there. And our last panelist, Deanna McMaster, so she's from Minter Ellison, where she's a partner. And, we've worked with Deanna. Sorry, I see a typo in my slide there, Deanna. I'll fix that. So just helping us with safety investigations. So a lot of experience there, and we welcome Deanna to that. So I'm going to hand over to Nectaris, and you may look after the screens there. Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction, Felicity, in organizing this panel. I will have 15 minutes to share with you what theory says about information and performance in health and safety, and some thoughts of mine while working in the industry and doing also projects for the industry during my research. So this is a graph from one book, Australian-based, actually published, about reasons for measuring performance. And we can all agree with the first two, I guess, to help set goals and strategy and review this strategy and sometimes our goals. The debate can be placed on the third step, especially rewarding and punishing, which is now outside the realm of what we believe as a good way to manage health and safety. So I would replace those reward and punishment with celebrate and reflect. That's my first, let's say, comment about what theory in an authoritative book says. Importantly, when we're talking about performance, we all understand it must be relevant. It cannot be anything that we can collect about data and whatever we can measure. It needs to make sense. It must be valid to measure whatever we want to measure, comparable, otherwise we cannot benchmark, we cannot see whether we go well or not over time, and reliable, meaning that if we repeat the same measurements by different people, by different maybe sources, or samples, we'll get the same result more or less. Now, regarding the information we collect, as you can see on the left, there's an information management model, which considers all steps. And the very first and important is why do we need those data, information that we collect, and how we store, distribute, use, maintain, and dispose. And it's very important to understand the needs, because those will drive the level of detail, how deep into the system we should go. We also need to consider the responsibility, who's gonna maintain, update the data, how sensitive those must be to capture the weak signals into the system, how we can preserve the quality, and who needs to have access. And on top of that, the data must be coupled to relevant indicators. Otherwise, there's no reason to collect them. Must be accurate enough, reliable, up to date, and supported by facts. And I'm going to cover a bit later what we mean by facts in information management. So this is a typical pyramid of what we usually see as safety performance, which is highly debated. The interesting part is that we still use it. So I follow many colleagues and other professionals on LinkedIn and publications, and everyone condemns those rates, those indicators. Still, everyone uses them. So that's an observation, and I have some suggestions later how we can move beyond those indicators. The problems with those indicators have been for long articulated by the industry and academia. It's not only academics who raise concerns. Underreporting, they're not explanatory. They describe the outcomes, specific thresholds that we put. They do not say anything about what could have happened. It's only very deterministic, very focused on the outcomes. That's why they cannot reflect near misses. They don't capture any latent problems in health, especially issues. They don't say anything about the future. It's everything about the past, and it's highly negative. It's about things that go bad sometimes, and they don't focus on what goes well. Now, how do we actually, how are we supposed to build a measurement regime in an organization? So we have great propositions from the literature. This is just one that specific author, Firesmith, actually developed for safety, security, and survivability. So we need to have a model. Model means a concept of how the system works and the specific construct like safety, how we do that, what contributes to what we name safety. And then the next step is to have a quality factor, so which represents the model and quality subfactors if applicable, if we want to break down those factors further. For each factor, we need to have a quality criterion, when this looks good and when this might not look good, and then attach a quality metric. So it's a systematic approach how to develop indicators. It's not whatever we can collect and we can measure as an indicator rate can be entered into this model if it does not satisfy the conceptual approach. What does the model represent? Most interestingly, if you see at the bottom of this graph, the outcome of this metric based on the criterion does not actually describe the safety or security or whatever we want to measure. It describes the system. So one of, I think, misperceptions or misuse of those lagging indicators, if we believe those are quite good to represent the safety model, is that we name them as occupational health and safety performance, which actually, according to literature and studies, is not. We can use them, but as system performance indicators. That's the second message I would like to share with you today. And also a review of literature we did a few years ago about what makes an indicator or a metric good. You can see on the list, I don't need to go in detail through all those characteristics, but it's important to try to attempt to develop metrics and indicators based on those characteristics. Apart from the meaning of the metric, of course, we need to consider practicalities. There is no metric I have come across that satisfies all those about 12 to 15 parameters. We cannot optimize everything. There will be problems and challenges with metrics and indicators. However, it's a nice list to refer to when we want to review what we have or when we consider to develop something new. And where in the system do we measure? So apart from the output, which is the obvious, the outcome of the system once more, we can measure at the input, the process itself, and the feedback. What are the differences? Indeed, the output is a reactive way. It's after the fact. Input is a more proactive place to develop metrics for. Then the process is also of interest, is the transactional, is the transformation of inputs to outputs. And the feedback is what gives us interpretations about the system. And if we manage to embrace all those four areas and measure all those together, then we can claim that we have an anticipative system regarding system performance. So if we cherry pick whatever is convenient, the process, the input or the output, we don't really get the full picture of a system. And what do we measure more exactly are those areas? We have the three big players, whether we receive as much as we expect, as much as we have designed, then the quality of what we receive and the timeliness. Do we provide, do we get things on time, earlier, sooner, and etc. My observation here from research and practice is that we are very much obsessed with quantity. I haven't seen really systematic ways to measure the quality and the timeliness of what we do. And those big three apply not only to the output, but also to the input, to the process, and the feedback. So that's the third message from my side. And what to collect? Indeed, decades ago, we were focusing mostly on hard data, the logs, the documents, records, things like that. Now, whether those were reliable and valid, it's another story, but that was the trend. Now, the few decades, like 2 decades, I would say 3 decades, now we also appreciate interviews, observations, which are more qualitative sources of data, but the inclusive management must include both when we have metrics. The reason is that hard data can be a bit more factual and soft data can be more contextual. And we need soft data to interpret and to give meaning to the hard data. How deep we can measure? Now, when we start measuring, and let's say we have a metric, then we might not be very happy with what we get, and we want to measure further. We want to decompose the system. Now, if the measurement satisfies the criterion that we have, we may want to stop there. To say, okay, everything looks good. Somebody would say, okay, does it look good because we control, we manage the situation systematically, or is it a matter of luck? Then yes, somebody would like to get deeper. But we must be mindful that the deeper we get into the system, the more offensive it can be when we over measure, over control things. And the deeper we get, the more we lose the system as a picture. We don't really get any information about the system. We get information about the detailed processes or elements of the system. And on top of that, lots of biases and heuristics. This is just a short list of what can go wrong when we measure. So confirmation bias, recall bias, attention bias, referee bias, all those play a role. We cannot eliminate those, are part of our human nature, but we must be mindful and we must question ourselves when we collect data, when we develop metrics, when we approach specific group of people to join a survey, whether we have a good picture of what we measure and any ways through which we can minimize the effects of those biases. And that's a representation. I stole that from a very good friend on LinkedIn, from Mr. James Pomeroy, who works for Arup. How things can evolve in organizations when we pick metrics and we choose indicators that are convenient, satisfy our views, do not challenge our views, and how those metrics can become a tyranny. So instead of using them to review and improve, to transform them into strict goals and dashboards and judge people, judge the system about the specific metrics. You will find the slides, I guess. Felicity will share our presentations with you. You can have a better look, but this is the main point out of this. And we should not forget, it's not only about health and safety in itself, that it's also about business performance. And whereas we focus on effectiveness of what we do in health and safety, we should not forget the efficiency and economy parameters. This is the language that management usually understands. And this is a nice way to complement and to your metrics, which once more have to do with effectiveness most of the times, and let's say propose case to the board of the organizations, to whoever has the authority to make decisions, to invest resources. It's not about whether we deliver something that we promised, but also did we need all those resources that the organization gave, and whether we used those resources with economy. And some final thoughts. As I said before, we should not throw the baby outside together with the bath water. Lagging indicators can have a place as long as we don't see them as health and safety indicators as performance, but system performance. The second is that we need to focus more on data quality and the strength of evidence, and not just measuring the quantity of processes, inputs, outputs, activities. We must understand also that, because I'm afraid we have been in the era of polling. I mean, I receive, I don't know how many surveys a week from professionals, from students, whoever. That's the very, I think, convenient way to collect opinions and perceptions. That those are great snapshots of what can happen in an organization-specific time point, especially when we don't have follow-up surveys. They can raise our awareness. They can make us think, could this happen to my organization? But they cannot be replicated outside their context. They must be seen within their context. That's very important. And I'm afraid we're not doing what we're supposed to do. Because I checked once more just to verify the Safety Act, Health and Safety Act, and the Health and Safety Regulations to 2011. And I found no mandate to measure performance through incident accidents. If you read the regulations 2011, when it comes to safety management systems, for example, they refer nothing about accident and incident rate. What they want from us to measure is whether we have the controls in place, whether those are effective, which cases they were ineffective. And this translates into those two bullet points. We need to measure somehow whether we have the least possible negative exposures and unsafe interactions within the workplace. And if we want to go beyond compliance and we care about the well-being and performance of humans and not just doing the job, then how we can also instill in the system positive exposures, the ones that help people grow and learn, and safe interactions. So thanks for listening. I think I was within time, Felicity, and I'm looking forward to any Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Nectaris. That's great. I'll hand over to Scott next for your presentation. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just share my screen. All right, so that was a great overview from Nectaris, and so there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap with what I'm talking about, but probably a little bit more around the university context for me. Currently, I think most of us are actually reporting a lot of lagging indicators. There's still a high prevalence of lost time incidents, hazard rates, and of course, workers' compensation data, return to work data, EAP data, etc. We really don't employ leading indicators as much as we should. We still, as Nectaris indicated, whilst Heinrich's triangle theory has sort of been debunked, we still focus on the number of unsafe incidents versus number of fatalities in our metrics. So we need to sort of look for ways to move away from that. We're also missing a lot of data in our reporting, and I guess with the changes in legislation around psychosocial hazards in particular, we really don't capture a lot of that information properly. A lot of our incident reporting systems are focused on physical risk. Our categories historically have been based on TOOKs, so it obviously relies again on an injury to have occurred to actually make that data meaningful. So as Nectaris mentioned, that doesn't really capture near misses very well. Our hazard identification reporting, it tends to be reactive, so we don't actually have a lot of people proactively reporting hazards. Our reports, when people do actually report a hazard, follow-up can be fairly superficial, and people may not bother reporting something next time if they don't feel like their input has been valued. Some people are very still suspicious about the confidentiality of reporting, and the complexity in reporting is often challenging for people as well. So again, it turns them off from making further reports. Our forms can be complex, and they often contain safety jargon. And when you talk to people around what is a mechanism of injury versus an agency of injury, even our health and safety professionals struggle with those terms. So all that report results in underreporting, and so our quality of data is pretty poor. Our interpretation of the data then it can even be worse. Obviously, our past performance does not predict our future performance. Committees are obviously often focused on our incident rates, but it's really quite meaningless. It's really what we do about those issues that emerge that changes the outcomes. Just looking at the outcomes themselves is not going to change anything. So we often, when things are going well, we give our committees, our senior management false assurances that everything's great, our incident reporting, our incident rates are dropping, so isn't everything wonderful? And the reality is we're probably drifting into failure because if management thinks everything's all right, they're not going to put resources into something that they don't need to. So We don't do good trend analysis. We don't really look at the statistical validity of any of our data. And so overall, we could say we are mostly reactive and not proactive. So one of the projects I was involved with at Griffith University was to look at our performance metrics and see if we could create a framework that made more sense. Worked with Tristan Casey in the Safety Science Innovation Laboratory, and they conducted a review of safety indicator literature for us over the last 10 years, and a few different frameworks in that. And so that was quite a useful literature scan. And they pulled out a number of useful bits of information from that. One of the things they identified is that lagging and leading, the terms lagging and leading are often used interchangeably. And so it gets very confusing. And so it's a bit like the chicken and the egg argument, which comes first. It makes it a bit confusing for people. So they proposed 4 key categories to frame the metrics that we use, and they are driving, monitoring, outcomes, and learning indicators. So I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. And it was really important to contextualize and validate the framework so that you could actually then predict safety and performance outcomes through that. So what are those 4 indicators and what do they mean? So driving indicators are around activities, development activities aimed at improving safety. So the initiatives and things that we implement. Monitoring indicators can be the potential of the organisation to create and achieve safety. Outcome indicators is the outputs of the work system, which we're all pretty familiar with the outcome indicators, and learning indicators. And to me, this is the holy grail of safety performance, is reflective activities aimed at improving the whole system. So when something goes wrong, do we actually learn from it? Do we actually communicate that information back through the organisation in a meaningful way that can actually affect change in the longer term? That's another view of it. So the safety of work is made up of those 4 elements. And if we just delve a little deeper into each of those categories, you can see there's a range of different types of metrics that can be applied to each of those categories. So driving indicators can include safety communication, auditing, safety leadership, preventative maintenance, workforce competence. So all your training data is a really good driving indicator. Due diligence measures as well. Are your executives getting due diligence training and measuring that? Is that being fed through the organisation? Monitoring indicators, obviously your safety climates and climate surveys, psychological safety climate, workload and other traditional HR measures can be there, such as your sick leave and things as well. General people's attitudes to safety. And then outcome indicators that we are all really familiar with. And then the learning indicators are the proactive investigations and communications that we do. There are a number of a bit more detail on each of those, but I'll flick through those, and I think Felicity will have those slides shared with you so you can have a look at that. And we have shared the original paper through the QUSA website as well, so people can go and look at that document in more detail. One of the things I put together for today too is just like, how do we actually present this in a university context? And most of our safety professionals are expected to come along to health and safety committees with a report. So I've got a rough outline of what a template might look like for a health and safety committee. I think my main message here is that we actually frame whatever metrics we're using in the context of what those things are actually measuring. So as Nectaria said, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Outcome indicators are important and people are interested in them, but we certainly want to de-emphasize them and frame them in the terms that that is all they are. They just represent how we have performed in the past. And we really want to focus on what's going to drive us forward in the future and improve our learning outcomes and ultimately our safety performance that way. So I think we also need to make sure we're reporting in line with a standard. And so this template sort of aligns with ISO 45001 and 45003. So you can see those key headings there: leadership, consultation, improvement, support, operation planning, and then performance evaluation are sort of aligned with that. And then under performance evaluation, we are, representing those metrics as they are: driving indicators, monitoring or outcome indicators. And some examples there, risk assessment status, mandatory training summary, and inductions. I also think that we need to be mindful that the metrics that we use need to be relevant to the organisation and its maturity at the time and how it's trying to drive change. One of the metrics we used at Griffith a little while ago was league tables for risk assessments. Now, I'm not a fan of league tables at the best of times, but it actually did the job at the time, because we found that there were a large number of business units that weren't doing any risk assessments. And by comparing and shaming those business units, you could see quite clearly that they weren't engaging in that culture. So by publicising that through the health and safety committees, we're able to get people to focus on that issue. There's no magic number to how many risk assessments you need, so it's very hard to put that into a metric. But by doing a rough estimation of, well, how many courses are they operating, how many activities are they doing, you could expect that the number of risk assessments they need is above zero. And so for a 12-month period, we published those league tables, and we got a shift in the culture in those business units. And then we've pulled away from that metric. So now we're looking at the quality of our risk assessments. And so now we've been looking at how frequently are the risk assessments that are in place being reviewed. And so I think we need to be mindful that the metrics don't need to be fixed, that they can change and evolve over time. Other thoughts? To be meaningful, safety performance data needs to focus on harm prevention and safety capacity building. We need to know what's happening, so we really need to understand the work. And reporting systems are useful and gives us an idea of what's going on, but it's not the whole picture. With our reporting, we do need to concentrate on building that reporting culture and make it easier, because we don't have big teams, so we can't get around all the time. But if we're just relying on that information solely, we're not going to get the whole picture. So I think we should be looking at developing learning teams that look at why things normally go well and not just what goes wrong. We need to get out there and talk to the end users so that we find out the deeper stories, the underlying things. And it may lead us to have to do some micro experimentation in those areas, try and test out what works and what doesn't work, and then we can share that across the entire organisation if those initiatives are successful. As I've already said, we need to focus on learning, driving and monitoring indicators, and the simple ones are around training and competency, inspections and audits, risk assessments, and learning team findings and communications around safety across the organisation. Most of that data is readily available in most universities already. I know some of the other more cultural measures and surveys and things can be a little bit harder to access and get information in a timely manner. But all that other data is readily available and can be easily presented in dashboards and made real time, so that can be shared with committees on a regular basis. But I think that the big message is we really need to be clear about what the data actually indicates to our decision makers. If we present LTIs as going down, that's great. But if the LTIs are going down, but the number of incidents and permanent harm is going up, it doesn't really say that we're a safer organisation at all. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Scott. So, Scott, I need you to do stop sharing.
Yep. There we go. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And then I can start sharing. So I'm just going to share the slides that Peter sent through to me a few weeks back. So I acknowledge that when he sent this to me, it was sent in draft format for him. So he said, you know, it been drafted for him by his colleagues because he is unable to attend today, and he asked two colleagues and they couldn't help out either. I'm doing this presentation. I haven't been given permission to share these slides with you. So I'm acknowledging that, but I felt that the information in the slides was useful and might just add to our conversation. So acknowledging our work within that context. Okay, so these were just the questions that I put to Peter when I asked him to be part of the panel. So what are we looking at? You know, what is the regulator looking at when they're coming on site to investigate, and how might they use industry data to help them? So that was his brief. So just by way of background, acknowledging the three pieces of legislation that our Office of Industrial Relations works under within Queensland, and the areas that they are looking at in that slide. Okay, so really just a regulatory body working within the context of these pieces of legislation. So what Peter is saying here is that industry level performance data is only useful if it is considered good information, and there's legislation through workplace health and safety which guides organizations in ensuring that they comply with the information requirements and can demonstrate compliance through their documented process. So just noting, you know, Nick Terra spoke about the fact that there wasn't a requirement to collect certain types of information or data. There are two pieces of the legislation, or two sections, 19 and 27, where 19 refers to organizations being able to demonstrate that they have understood their hazards, that they've taken proactive measures to eliminate those hazards or to control those hazards, such as having health and safety reps, having committees, and having consultations. So that's section 19, and section 27, which we refer to often, is just talking about the responsibilities of the PCBU to ensure that they have considered information regarding incidents, hazards, and risks, and responded to those in a timely way. So he adds there that the regulator does or should be requiring evidence of these two. So it's something that when an inspector does come out, they might look for actions that relate to what is required in section 19 and section 27. So there are some guides on the Queensland Workplace Health and Safety websites that talk about what inspectors do when they do come out. So there is that information. The regulator's looking, I think that it's the way his slides read, is my understanding is that they wanted to implement this 5-step inspection process to focus more on systematic WHS management, to increase examination, to increase the focus on what organizations are doing in relation to their using their performance data. So these are the 5 steps. So categorize case, business, risk profile, determine areas to monitor and enforce compliance, monitor compliance, action compliance decisions, and close out cases. So he says this feedback goes back, this feeds back into the risk-based targeting and allows us to review what we focus on and ensure our approach to the strategy remains relevant. And he has also said that we're taking data from step 1 and step 2 to shape our Workplace Health and Safety Queensland priority plans. So that's the area that Peter works in. So he then gives an example of a forklift driver. There is more information on the WHS Queensland website, but he says, for example, if we receive a notification of an incident where a worker suffered injuries while working alongside a forklift and was struck by it, we'd consider the role of traffic management and work design to minimize the potential for this type of injury to occur. Performance data is useful to prevent this type of incident from occurring. So what sort of consultation with workers occurs on the work processes? Have there been previous incidences or near misses involving forklifts in the workplace? And what changes have been implemented, and how do we know that they are working? So investigations would then be continuing. They'll review these internal organization items to provide further insight. So they'd look at desktop audits, what processes, what training materials are available, walking through with checking for signage, and then observational walkthrough, ensuring compliance, like people wearing seatbelts, sounding horns, and other mitigating measures. And then just checking, again, audits, checking for maintenance registers for forklifts and related equipment. So in reviewing those types of documents, the observations is something that the Office of Industrial Relations Queensland have taken into account when they've designed their 5-step model for inspectors. Okay, so he's then given me this slide. I'll talk through it. It's around performance data being used to identify breakdowns in systems and opportunities for improvements. So using the example of hygiene. So they do risk-based targeting, and they use industry sector data rather than organizational specific data. And sometimes they'll also make use of WorkCover's claims history. So looking at hygiene data, focusing on the type of harm, try to identify themes. And so it's not just a quantitative approach. They recognize that they're not going to have hard data for everything. So and I think those are the things that Teresa has also alluded to as well, is we don't always have the quantitative data. So you really need to go through consultation with industry to identify what important things we should be doing. By way of this example only, and not based on real data or the actual focus. So then we need to target this information to establish priorities, interventions, resourcing across all of the Office of Industrial Relations, even where should we be targeting safety advocates and ambassadors for the maximum input. So they've been working on their next strategic plan, and so they'll be considering this data in their strategic planning. Other data, so this is just performance data that they bring in when the regulator is putting in place new strategies. So they're just triangulating data sources from various places. And then just talking around reasonable steps, what performance indicators. So returning to the Act, which considers performance data collection used in its very text, which section 27 states that a business or undertaking requires, so far as reasonably practical, to have processes for receiving and considering information regarding incidents, hazards, and risks, and responding in a timely way. So a 2017 report from Safe Work Australia, published by Sharon O'Neill and Karen Wolf, this referred to on the slide, supports this comprehensive measuring and reporting is a reasonable step as required in section 27. And the report states that, and quoting, exercising due diligence in decision-making is an essential element of good business practice. And the article highlights how performance data is in fact a piece of WHS intelligence which we can't ignore. So I found this article quite an interesting one, and we can probably put that onto our website as well. So performance data, the question continues to further this point. The article discusses how the kinds of performance data used is also relevant, especially if you consider how different indicators can be used at different stages in the safety cycle. And just ending with figure 2 from the report, which provides a good flow chart linking how information or performance data, as we've been referring to in the panel, should not only be acquired but also understood. And often this is the part which people struggle with, because it's an understanding that leads to the operation of changes due to performance data. So it's not just about having good data, but also knowing about how and when to use it beyond what is legislated in the WHS Act, and also then to make your workplaces safer to work in. So that ends. I hope that I have done Peter and the Office of Industrial Relations justice in their presentation, and I will seek his permission to share the presentation and also the notes that he has under there to help you unpack it a little bit more. So I can share that with you afterwards. And I would now like to just welcome our last speaker, Deanna, from Minter Ellison, and then we can open things up for discussion and have some questions that I hope you've been thinking about. I certainly have a few. So Deanna, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides. I guess I've got the benefit of going forth this morning and being able to say I agree with everything that everyone has spoken to before now. I think it's probably fair to say that as a lawyer, for a number of years, we've been trying to convince our clients to start stepping away from that focus on LTI statistics and other lag data. And it's wonderful this morning to hear all the panelists share that view and give some really practical tips to all of us about the way we might do that. So I think the biggest danger that we see in focusing on lag data from a legal perspective is that it can lead to a culture where people don't want to report incidents. And as we all know, the best way to get ahead of something quite awful happening is to look at those lower level warning signs and being able to take action before it gets to the point where something very serious arises. So we often find ourselves challenging our education clients, including at university level, to actually celebrate some high lag indicators, because it means you've got a workforce that wants to tell you when things occur. So low level incidents or high near miss data is actually a really good sign that people feel safe to speak up about issues with safety in your workplace. So I think that might be the first thing, is to challenge some thinking about that. And where you've got university councils or other management bodies that get really fixated on high data, low-level incident data, I think it's important that we explain to them all as safety professionals that that's actually something that should give them comfort. It's actually not something that should cause alarm, and it gives us a good guide on what we need to take action in relation to. So we've used lots of different terms this morning for the lead data. And I thought Scott's session was excellent, and perhaps one of the most concrete sessions I've ever listened to about how to describe that data in the right way. Safe Work Australia call it positive data. Either way, I can assure you from a legal perspective, there is an expectation from our regulator that we have clear lead data in any safety reporting. That's to middle management level, safety committees, and also to university councils. We really need to be giving them the information about the positive steps we're taking as well. And we've spoken a lot about that this morning, so I won't rehash it in any detail. But of course, it's particularly about training information, toolbox talks. The other things we're seeing really in this bucket now are, for example, bullying and harassment working groups you may have established, proactive safety audits you might do of a construction project at your university, and also some of those really wonderful HSR forums that many of you have up and running in the university sector, and you know, explaining the real positive developments you're having in those spaces. What I spend most of my time talking about as a lawyer is due diligence and how to protect our officers and senior managers from being exposed in relation to a personal breach of the safety laws. And absolutely we know that one way to do that is to present them with a very full set of data that's both lag data but also lead data. And I think as safety professionals, what we need to accompany that due diligence reporting with is then the language or the education for our councils and other senior managers on how to interpret what they're getting and how to question what they're getting. So it is, this is something that we can, I'm sure we all do well, but we can probably all take as a homework action from today and have another look at the data we're presenting as safety professionals and have a think about whether it's got that balance right between looking at things that have happened and then looking forward to things that haven't yet occurred. So the next slide I've got, it's really probably the best concrete example we've got of a court being very concerned about a lack of near-miss data being given to someone in an officer role with that due diligence duty. So this was from New South Wales, but as we all know, the provisions are exactly the same here in Queensland. And it was very clear that there needed to be a system to track near-miss information. So I think one thing for all of you to think about when we're talking about safety data is if you just live in a lost time injury world or a medical treatment world, I do wonder whether you are picking up those matters where you managed to avoid a lost time or a medical treatment, but it was still a safety issue. Putting on my very black hat lawyer view, most of the accidents we are involved in through the courts are ones where there was some warning sign in that near miss category. So before anyone got hurt, there was a chance to step in. So that can be really tricky because often people don't want to speak up, and that goes back to those earlier comments I made about encouraging reporting cultures. And that can be really challenging and probably the subject of a whole nother separate session. Just conscious of time as well. But one last thing I did want to specifically point out was I think the last 12 months have signalled a real change in what safety data we all need to be collecting. And I've been rather shocked at a number of Section 155 notices from safety inspectors, including in the education industries, where information is now being asked from a psychological perspective. How are we keeping people's psychological safety well and safe at work? And what data are we collecting to give our safety committees and our university councils a good picture of that? I was very surprised to have a safety inspector ask one of my clients how they were tracking exit survey data. So from a safety perspective, they were asked, were there any trends in your exit surveys? Unfortunately, because of a lack of sharing of information between HR and safety teams, that was a really difficult question to answer from a safety perspective. The other thing we're seeing safety data being expected to capture is details about absenteeism in particular teams and grievances and engagement surveys so that you can identify hotspots with your data. So that's just a quick snapshot, but I think one emphasis point from my session this morning is if you are just looking at physical injury data and forward-looking trends, it's really time to change that and bring into the mix some really quality information about how you were tracking in terms of managing psychological risk. And I know a number of you on the call, and particularly Felicity, are quite passionate about that. So I'm sure there's great thinking about that amongst this group, but it was just something I wanted to flag. Felicity, I might hand back to you so that we've got enough time for some questions at the end now.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Deanna. Yeah, so I asked Deanna today, I said to her, I've got a question for you, and that relates to the psychosocial hazards, what data we need to get, because some of us work in departments that are separate from HR, and some of us sit within the HR departments of our universities. But even if we are within that, getting access to that information and who should be getting that information and how is that shared to inform potential risks that we might have that we would then need to address. So, and I think some of that goes to subjective data or qualitative data, which is always more difficult to collect because you're collecting those views and perspectives of people. So, and we all touched on those kind of themes. It's easy to collect the quantitative data. I wondered, are there questions from anybody at this point in time?
Yeah, I think Brian's asked us a question about what others are doing with exit interview data, and I'd love to hear from others on the call with that as well. I know that some of the challenges have been, as Felicity's just said, HR teams not wanting to share with safety teams. And that was actually a key matter identified at the Australian Institute of Health and Safety seminar last week, is how do we work more closely with HR teams to get that sort of info. So I'd love to hear if anyone's got any thoughts on how, whether you are getting HR exit survey data and, how you are managing to capture that information.
Yeah, if I could just make a comment there as well. I don't have any magic solution for this, but in a conversation I had at a safety conference recently with one of the regulators, they made it clear that HR need to share this data with safety teams, that they expect that safety teams will be using their existing processes to report on things like harassment, bullying, that they shouldn't be just held in a separate HR system. The details can be held in a separate HR system, sure, but the actual data, the number of cases, the case load, there should be some light shone on that in the organisations. The regulator also made it very clear they are well aware of the behaviour of large organisations in this respect, and they are looking to prosecute, particularly in the psychosocial space. And we've seen now that Victoria is actually making it in their legislation to actually require organisations to report how many bullying and harassment complaints and other psychosocial hazards are occurring, and they need to provide that data every 6 months. And I think the regulators will not be treating it nicely if they don't provide any data.
Thanks, Scott. That, very, very interesting point that, just seeing what Victoria are doing in relation to the psychosocial. I'm not sure if anybody has an update. My understanding is that Queensland will still be following a process similar to what New South Wales, so code of practice along similar lines. But
that's right, Felicity. In Queensland, the latest update is that we will, in the second half of this year, receive the draft code of practice on psychosocial risk. And in Queensland, interestingly, we'll be splitting out occupational violence into a separate code and that will be received early next year. And there's still discussions ongoing about whether sexual harassment will actually be dealt with in an amendment to the WHS regulation in Queensland, which will be a difference to New South Wales. So I very much watch this space for all of us, I think.
Because Western Australia have four codes, so they've also split their codes. Yes.
Yep.
All right, that's excellent. All right, any other questions from people? Anyone want to comment on what universities are doing in relation to Brian's question there? Is anybody getting exit data? Any of the universities getting exit data yet? We're not. But
I can just agree from my perspective, Felicity, we weren't doing anything with that data. We were lucky if that data went beyond the supervisor. So it was encouraged that an exit interview was held, but generally it wasn't done well, and there's no collation of that data.
I think the key with that data is we don't, the problem I've started seeing when it's come through from a safety perspective, and I mean this with absolute respect, is we would often send our very junior HR administrators to the interviews. And some of the comments that would be written down are things that from a legal chair made me a bit nervous. So sort of sweeping comments about problems with culture, for example. So I think as we are using that data now from a safety perspective, I do think it's probably important for safety teams to give HR teams the heads up about how we will be using it and how it might be important to send someone relatively senior to the meeting so that the notes collated and the trends we're tracking are ones that are sort of thought through rather than perhaps, look, I just think there's some merit in training those people who are going to go to those interviews.
Thanks, Deanna. So I think this might be something we need to have another discussion on. And, there are people who are not here today in the psychosocial space within our community who would probably like to participate. Make some points and take it to them. I know that ours is an online process. So it is collected anonymously through a survey as opposed to speaking to somebody. So it's data that they collect in that way. Scott, I was interested in how you were able to use lag data, number of risk assessments being done to change behavior. And I think that that's a really interesting concept of going, how do we take this information and what do we want to do with it? So if we're taking our data, say on the number of risk assessments, and then unpacking that with our committee. So what does this mean? And how can we use this to change behavior and influence the way people do things? So there's that element of moving beyond just here's the data, but perhaps making recommendations to our committees around, so what does this mean and what can we do with this data? And so seeking, and that starts to bring your consultation piece into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Felicity. I think we really try to drive change in our organisation, and so the metrics shouldn't just be a stagnant thing that just gets presented to committees and go, and everyone looks at the pretty pictures and goes, that's great, that's nice, move on. I think the other metrics we should utilise more is actions. So when we do audits, that the action items that come out of those audits, what are the status of those, or if they're an inspection as well, making sure that we're closing the loop on what we find and that we actually share that information and actually rectify the issues. Same with incidents, that an action plan should be developed when an incident occurs or an near-miss, and that those then are tracked, and committees should be monitoring those as part of their due diligence to make sure we've actually taken those actions and it's been done in a timely fashion.
Excellent, thanks, Scott. Sarah's asked a question just around or commentary around training, and I think we're all under pressure to get training completed in as short a time as possible and condensing it. And the risk there is that we have short training programs that maybe don't address everything, and then we just can produce a training record and say, yep, people have done this training and we've ticked a box. It's, for me, I was just thinking in collecting the training data, thinking about a common law claim that I worked on, where we were asked around how many safety toolbox talks were held in an area leading up to the incident. I think we always think we're special in the universities and we think we're unique, but we've got all these different workplaces and they deal with a whole bunch of different activities. They're across multiple locations and sites. We're not recording what happens in local levels, and that relates to, I suppose, some of the qualitative actions that are being taken that we can't measure, or I don't know if we can measure. And maybe, Nectarius, because you spoke about those qualitative pieces of data. What are those, and how can we implement them in our very big universities that we've got?
Yeah, that's a nice question. First of all, I agree with Sarah. The quality of what we do is a huge issue. We don't look after quality that much. We just want to tick the box. It doesn't apply only to investigations, risk assessments, training, investigations, risk assessments, everything. Sometimes we're so, fast to complete those activities that we really miss the point and whether they contribute really to health and safety. So I would like to distinguish between quality and qualitative data. So quality has to do whether what we deliver covers the needs of the recipient and the organization. So do we deliver training? Indeed. Okay. Do we really have an effect? Do we influence the training? That's the quality of training. And get back to what you said about behaviors. Now, qualitative data means that you can have a survey after training, and you can collect data like at scale about the quality, about the design, about the instructor, the medium, online or face-to-face, but also some information, as we do with the students at universities for the academic courses, where they state improvements, remarks, ideas, any limitations, and things like that. And we academics connect the rates 3, 4, or 5 out of 5 with those data, with this information, qualitative information to improve the course. Because if I just have a 3 out of 5 and I have no comment, what am I supposed to do? How can I bring my course from 3 to 4 and from 4 to 5? So this is why it's very important to collect quantitative and qualitative data, and then the one supports the other. And one also comment I would like to make on this discussion, you will see frequently in reports and journal articles, this attempt to correlate health and safety metrics with number of accidents, leading and lagging. To my humble opinion, this is irrelevant and invalid. Because I said before, with the leading indicators, you measure what you believe contributes to health and safety. Training, assessments, investigation, toolbox meetings, once more, quantity, quality, and timeliness. With the accidents, it doesn't have to do with health and safety, it has to do with system performance. And the system does not perform only about health and safety. Whatever we do in health and safety interacts with whatever happens in a system regarding productivity, efficiency. There's so many factors, so many things that happen around that it's very difficult to associate health and safety metrics dedicated to health and safety with system outcome metrics. That's something we should, I think, consider and try to avoid this question. I listen to sometimes, if we increase training, if we have better training, are we gonna have fewer accidents? No, I don't know, and you will never know. If your question is, if I improve my training, will I have fewer negative interactions and exposures of people to any hazardous agent, to any psychosocial and physical hazardous agent? That's a great question. And this is what you can measure, but not on the other side of the equation, of the spectrum.
Thanks, Nick. Do we have any other questions or observations, things that struck people? No? I had a few others in relation to the concept around, well, an observation around trying to create a safety culture, and then, but at the same time, we get caught up in this compliance of being able to produce data on things, and how, just wondering that maybe I think they might work in opposition to each other. So if we get caught up in compliance and kind of I've done this and I've done this kind of thing, that's around recording quantifiable, metrics that we can report on, but that when we create more of that safety culture, where people are just living safety in every aspect, it's not something that it's easy to report on. It's more that kind of the feeling that people get that they support it in their workplace, that they take health and safety concerns seriously, and that kind of thing. So it isn't a thought that I've completely thought through, but I was just, it came to mind, I guess, when I was listening to the conversations. Thank you. All right, well, if there are no further questions, observations, I will say thank you very much, everybody, for attending. That would be great. Yeah, I'll be looking to share the slides and the recordings. Brian, you've come online. Have you got a question or a comment?
Well, thank you, Felicity. I was just going to say, I've just emailed UQHR asking for the exit interview data. But what is equally relevant is the transfer data. When somebody transfers out of an org unit, where does that data go? Is that an opportunity to find out why that person's leaving? Because I'm struggling with inducting people who are transferring in. They're not treated as new staff. So we're assuming a whole heap of information. And so I wonder if the people where they've just left got any data. So that's what I was going to. Again, I was typing that in, but I failed to get that in time. But I think there's another huge amount of data at UQ with people transferring between org units. That's all. Thank you. Thanks for facilitating.
Right. Thank you, Brian. Jim, did you have a question for us or an observation? No? Okay. No, you're on mute now, Jim.
Hi, Felicity. I've just joined because I was in a Senate risk meeting, so I came in late, but I'm glad to see that you had this recorded.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, it'd be lovely to share. I will get it all fixed up, and I will let the OSA community know when it's available and when the slides are available. Yeah, so that'd be great. Brian, I think what I do know was commonly noted is that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. So, it's often it's the person that they report to that makes the difference as to whether people stay or go. So there we have it. All right. So again, thank you everybody for attending. It was lovely to see so many of you. To Nectarius, to Scott, and to Deanna, thank you so much for your time in putting the slides together. And I acknowledge and thank Peter, who's absent, for his presentation as well. For the Queensland members, I will set a date to have an in-person get together with an option to link via Zoom for those who are further afield. I see Carly up there in the corner of my screen. So those of you that come from further afield in Queensland, to try and incorporate you into our group. Any suggestions, any ideas for further online sessions like this, professional development? I'm happy to take them. And thank you again, everybody, for attending. It was lovely to see you.